Hi, I'm Alan C. Duncan with Rob Walgate on The Public Square. Today we're continuing our conversation with friend of The Public Square and former Deputy Chief in the Office of Communications of the NASA Glenn Research Center, David DeFelice. We've been talking Artemis II and space exploration this week. And David, I want to begin this broadcast with what I'll call a conspiracy question or confession maybe. Because now people do have to stop and think, is this video that I'm seeing online AI? There is that going around. So I'm actually very sympathetic to conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists, especially after COVID, especially after some more JFK files keep coming out by the thousands. I'm open to conspiracy theories, but I just can't quite get on board with the faked moon landing. I don't think I'm sure you get this. Please, what are some of the things that you could tell to help people?
One of my personal thoughts is along the same line. So the movie Apollo 13 full-up theatrical release came out in 1995.
Great movie,
and
I think.
I was so impressed by the visual effects. And I remember saying out loud, I am so glad we did this mission in 1970 and not 1995. Otherwise, all these arguments would be so much harder to fight back and say, no, we didn't do it. To me, one of the most simple arguments was a recent video clip I heard from one of the moonwalkers, Charlie Duke, who happens to be a strong believer. He says, if we faked it, why did we do it 9 times? you just like, we did it, we're done. Okay, we got it done. Some of the other things that come up that way are, if you're familiar with the story of Chuck Colson and all the President's Men, the Watergate scandal and all that way, he talked about it in the context of none of the 12 apostles and none of the 11 ever denying that they saw Christ risen, crucified, risen, and continuing on that way. And even under torture and duress and all, no one ever recanted that way. And he said, the Watergate scandal, they couldn't keep it for, days before it all blew up and all that way. So there's never been, any astronaut, any flight director, anybody ever, came out and said, nah, really, we were just, and I'm sure some of them probably even offered big money just to come out and do that. But, to tarnish your career and do all that for that. I think we may touch on some of the geopolitical ones, but, when someone says, well, we didn't do it, it's like, okay, what was the context of the space race of Apollo? And it was the space race against who? Some say the Russians. Well, technically, it's the Soviet Union and all that way. So if there's a space race going on, and I just spent a weekend with my grandsons who are 7 and 5, everything's a race. Who can first? Everyone's the rules. Everything is a competition. No, that's not the rules. We can't do that. If we didn't really go to the moon, who was in the best position to say, nah, we didn't see anything. There was no trajectories. Yeah. It would have been the Soviets saying, you did not. It's a lie. And, you see that in certain things. There's all kinds of that. They never even made a veiled attempt to even in any way discredit. They basically just tipped the cap and said, you won the race. To me, that's the strongest argument. You go beyond that, and I've held moon rocks in my hand, and I've looked at them and say, it's the ultimate souvenir. And you bring it back. And again, these are not things that we've just put in museums. Scientists from around the world could sign up to study these moon rocks. Not one of them ever said this rock was never anywhere other than Earth.
Well, I'm going to ask a stupid question because I'm not a rocket scientist. But when gathering those type of things and bring them back, is there any concern or worry like, hey, these could be hazardous. Hey, these could be radioactive. Hey, there could be something wrong with. Is there any concern of that, or were they studied so many times before that you knew what you were putting back in the ship?
So, just like in the last episode, we talked about the astronauts being quarantined before they went. They were, especially Apollo 11. There was a serious quarantine procedure all through. They had to be in isolation for several days, and they had to do the same thing with any of the moon rocks because, they had to be, very careful. They also had to be careful they didn't sneeze on a moon rock, when they brought it back inside. They put it, carefully collected the samples, had protection that way. Those were all, making sure there was no radiation, no, germs. And I mean, obviously they would have been excited to find signs of life, but if that sign of life or form of life was something that would have been detrimental to human health or existence, that would have been definitely a concern, but they definitely went through all that. I've actually heard some of the frogmen who retrieved the Apollo 11 crew talk about some of the washdown things that they did and all that way, and said it was interesting and probably would not have been as effective as they intended. But
what'd you say, the frogmen?
frogmen. So if you saw, even with the Apollo, the Artemis 2 mission, they sent out Navy divers to kind of secure things.
That was wild because they had on cameras.
Yep.
So when they welcomed them all back by name, I'm like, this is like. But what was interesting to me is, like, when we get home from a family trip, I feel like RJ and Rod, everyone's throwing their seatbelts off, can't wait to get out of the car, and the 4 astronauts are just, they know they're in there and someone's coming to get them, right?
Plus, they've been 10-day missions, not too bad, but there's a sense of disequilibrium could be a problem. You don't want to be falling over or doing that. The muscles haven't been working. They did some exercises to maintain muscle tone and all that way, but you certainly want to be careful. So actually what they just did, I saw a video update from Reed Wiseman. Normally you say, okay, they just gone through all this training and everything. The astronauts, we're going to let you guys just rest for a while. They actually had them in simulators doing tasks that like they'd have to do on the moon again, because if you travel 10 days to get to the landing on the moon, then all of a sudden you have to get out and do that. And if you're going to start having, getting dizzy and having other issues and all that way, they wanted to get a sense of that. So,
well, can you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned that their muscles were basically not used the same way that they are on the Earth. To me, that makes it sound, that's like a fine-tuning argument for the existence of God to me. Just the fact that gravity itself is healthy for us, or for our bodies. Can you talk about that from a scientific perspective at all?
Yeah, the uniqueness of everything being so fine-tuned, every aspect of life on Earth, in terms of how far the Earth is from the sun, the amount of radiation. The moon itself is kind of a sweeper for meteorites and things, kind of takes a hit for us quite a bit. That way, but the human body was designed to be in a full Earth gravity, 32.2 feet per second squared, or 9.8 meters per second squared. You guys remember that from high school physics?
But I do not.
Yeah, actually, I'm impressed. I actually remember the numbers. I haven't used them in a while, so but used them a lot. But everything's fine tuned. But even everything, Our heart is, placed in where it is in the chest cavity, below the head and above the waist and all that way. It's used to pumping blood out to the toes and up to the head. There's actually a repositioning of body fluids based on the position of the heart and the absence of gravity. So the astronauts on space station have treadmills and resistive, weights that they can lift and do things that way. You have to be a lot more compact in the Artemis. So they had a small resistive trainer type of a device that they used that they said worked really well.
So as the crew preps for this, we're talking about the physical stuff, but there's a mental side to this too, is there not?
Absolutely.
To be prepared to leave Earth. And this was a 10-day mission. So, obviously some missions have been significantly longer, but can you talk a little bit about the mental side as well, what that looks like?
And that goes all the way back to the astronaut selection process. People who've demonstrated the ability to work well in teams and groups, kind of like the kindergarten report card, plays well and gets along with others. Really important when you're in 4 people in an area that's even maybe a quarter of the size of the room that we're in right now. Very little privacy, essentially none. And how you do that, dealing with stress and pressure, how you respond under that way, not lashing out at others. It's the mental aspect is equally important to the physical aspect, and being able to process, and sleep deprivation, stress, all those types of things.
And I imagine that's a very highly competitive process to be selected. Because I'm sure there's thousands of people that want to be selected to go.
I think on the order of 10,000 to get maybe 8 positions.
10,000 to get 8 positions.
Yeah, and it takes persistence too. Most astronauts apply multiple times. I know some of the astronauts I'm friends with, they've applied 5 times maybe before they got in. And what can you do to improve? Maybe you hadn't been scuba certified yet, so you go back and get scuba certified. International Space Station is a partnership with Russia and other countries. Maybe you go add a language, to your things, what you can do. So next time you go in, you've shown you've done something to improve yourself.
Because I feel like, little kids, when you ask little kids what they want to be, astronauts are an answer that you hear because they think of, the wonder of the child, right?
Yeah, it was good. I was at a play area with my grandkids yesterday, and about half the boys had either planets or rockets or something on their T-shirts, and it's like it's coming back that way, and it's really neat to see.
Very much so.
You mentioned you mentioned the International Space Station, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the geopolitical impact of all this. Where do you want to go with that?
So the International Space Station by name is primarily a partnership between the United States and Russia, and about most of the segments are really almost balanced between the Russian segments, the U.S. segments. There's a European module, there's a Japanese module. So it truly is an international endeavor, and other countries have contributed. The robotic arms are provided by Canada. And so, when we did the Apollo missions, that was purely a U.S., flag-waving prestige, type of a thing. The decision was with the Artemis program is that they would do it with an international effort. And so actually created something they call the Artemis Accords. And they've had some 20, 30 countries sign on as, supporting the mission, saying it's a good thing and trying to find some role, some contributions and all that way. But not everyone is playing as nicely in the sandbox, I guess, if you will. Soviet Union became Russia. They say they have their issues. They're trying to fight a war in Ukraine, and it's been a drain that way. They've really slipped, in terms of their not technical capabilities, but their actual resourcefulness to do much in terms of space. And so China has actually been going through their own space race. They realized they were decades behind and have been pouring a lot into it. And they've declared they want to have a presence, land astronauts on the moon by 2030. And, we don't want to, from an American perspective, see China get what you call the high ground. And I would say it was more political, geopolitical back in the 60s with the Soviet Union. It was more pride, prestige. Our way of life is better than yours. But I'm hearing more sincere, terminology like high ground and, losing a foothold. And, there's international treaties, and no one's allowed to claim the moon or any territory thereof that way. But there's a strong sense of there's a seriousness of it, and there could be a significant impacts if China were to have a moon base and the U.S. not have one.
Yeah. Okay. So to bring it to that, first of all, that's amazing. I did not know about the treaties to not claim the moon. That in of itself should almost dispel some of the moon landing conspiracy theories. We actually have to have treaties to say, hey, you can't take the moon. That's amazing.
You have to have them. You have to also honor them, though.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge.
Well, the one thing I looked up was the size of the moon, because I was thinking, I'm like, I don't even know the size of it. And it's about the quarter of the size of Earth. Is that correct?
Yeah, the gravitational is about 1/6 gravity. Okay. So when you see the astronauts walking and bouncing and such that way, it's because the gravity's less, but the muscles are still strong.
Gotcha.
I was watching somebody give a demonstration. I mean, correct me if I saw something wrong, but it seems much further away than we often like to think it is.
It's about 250,000 miles away, and for relative, where the International Space Station is 250 miles away.
Wow. Okay.
So you're talking a factor of 1,000 difference between them that way, and very, very different. Like I said, when you'll appreciate this analogy, Rob. So when you're on the space station, looking at the Earth is like holding up a basketball about above your shoulder, and you can see curvature, you can see but you can't quite see all of it that way. And we saw the images from Artemis. You see the whole thing, and the famous scene in Apollo 13 where Jim Lovell's in his backyard, and he's you're sitting and you can just cover the moon with your thumb. Well, when you're out at the moon, you can cover the Earth with your thumb.
Wild.
That's amazing.
Wild.
Okay, so we talked about bases on the moon. That's a real goal, right?
That's a real goal, and primarily it's scientific. There's some possibility of commercial enterprises that could happen there. But the real advantage, the goal for the U.S. eventually is to be able to go on to Mars. And there's thinking that if we find significant amounts of usable water ice, as we've seen evidence of there, water is hydrogen and oxygen, rocket fuel is hydrogen and oxygen, you could actually launch under the 1/6 gravity a mission from there more easily, kind of stage everything there and launch a mission from the moon instead of from the surface of the Earth. So there's some exploration implications there.
What does NASA? I don't know if you can answer this. What does NASA make of SpaceX? Do they do joint ventures sometimes, or are they totally separate?
Absolutely. So the decision was made when the shuttle program was coming to the end. Basically, the main purpose of the space shuttle program was to build the International Space Station. You didn't need a full space shuttle just to bring astronauts back and forth. So the decision was to contract that out. Ideally to a couple different contractors. SpaceX was the first one to deliver on the capability of doing crew and also cargo missions as well. There's another competitor, Orbital Sciences, that can also bring cargo up there. And then we all remember over the past year with Boeing and their Starliner, the issues they had. They're supposed to be the second operational mode of getting astronauts back and forth, and hopefully Boeing will catch up and get things going. So it was an intentional commercial partnership that was a matter of national policy. NASA people, when we would travel, we didn't use NASA airplanes to go around. We would buy a ticket on United or American or go places. So the thought was we should be doing that for our astronauts as well. But the SpaceX also has its own ambitions. They'd like to, Elon Musk, regardless of whether or not the U.S. does it or pays for it, would like to send people to Mars and back and such. So there's a little bit of competition, but I think the competition can be good. But it's a very different way of doing business. SpaceX basically, you could probably see Elon Musk probably didn't feel like he answers to anybody, but there are board and shareholders and all that, so they answer to them. NASA answers to the American people. And, Elon can just afford to blow up a rock and say, oh, cool, we learned something good, let's try it again. That doesn't work. It worked a little bit back in the 60s when, from that aspect of it, but people look at it as a major failure that if NASA were to blow up a rocket. And so, we certainly would not try to do that from that perspective. So it's a different way of doing business, but they're really kind of hand in hand. And now, SpaceX has been a little bit slow, in my opinion, to deliver on some of their promises. They've gotten called out a couple times on it. They won the initial contract to build a lunar lander, and they're going to use their Starship for it. They still haven't put humans in a Starship. They haven't done a full successful orbital mission yet. So if you can't orbit the moon, we're not going to trust you. Orbit the Earth, we're not going to trust you to orbit the moon and land and come back. Blue Origin, which is the Jeff Bezos company, has something they're calling a Blue Moon. And their own design for a lander looks more like a traditional Apollo lander. And so what's next up for both of them is basically an invitation, perhaps even a challenge for the next Artemis mission, which they're calling Artemis 3, which would be to launch a crew up on using the Space Launch System and the Orion. But instead of going to the moon, there's an invitation to both SpaceX and to Blue Origin to provide a lunar lander into Earth orbit to do rendezvous and docking, to open up the hatches, test out some spacesuits, and do all that type of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see if either one or both are ready to meet that challenge.
That's
supposed to happen next year.
Next year. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about bases potentially on the moon, launching missions from the moon, people on Mars. I'm sure Elon Musk would like to build bases on Mars. This all is very exciting to me, but I also am a big C.S. Lewis guy. And I know that in the writings of C.S. Lewis, he had a kind of a caution and a check on human advancement into space. And again, he's one guy, but he is a very influential Christian writer and thinker. So I want to read you a quote from his space trilogy, one of the books from it, Paralandra, and just get your thoughts on it, if you don't mind. So he's talking about one of the professors who's an antagonist in his story. This is Professor Weston. He calls him, this Professor Weston, a man obsessed with the idea, which at that moment is circulating all over the planet. It is the idea that humanity, having now sufficiently corrupted the planet where it arose, must at all cost contrive to seed itself over a larger area, that the vast astronomical distances, which are God's quarantine regulations, must somehow be overcome. But beyond that lies the sweet poison of the false infinite, The wild dream that planet after planet, system after system, in the end, galaxy after galaxy, can be forced to sustain everywhere and forever the sort of life which is contained in the loins of our own species. A dream begotten by the hatred of death upon the fear of true immortality. So I know there's a lot there. What's your first thought upon hearing just kind of that thought from Lewis?
So I think part of it is there is some of the motivation I'm hearing there of why people think we need to go to Mars, which is if we mess up this planet bad enough, we need some place to retreat to. And I think that's kind of pervasive in science fiction. And I embrace, science fiction. I actually used to do a presentation where I would look at Hollywood movies and talk about how real science and movie science in science fiction would mutually inspire and build off of each other. Really good science fiction looks at some of the nascent technologies that NASA is using and developing and kind of projects them into the future. Hence, Star Wars and Star Trek, those types of things. But there are people at NASA who are inspired by the science fiction and the visions. And so it's a whole another conversation we can have. So I think there's some real motivation there. I look at it in terms of, I like that they use the word quarantine because we talked about quarantining astronauts, quarantining moon rocks. We don't want to contaminate that way. So the idea that we would need to quarantine these other worlds from the sinful effects of humanity, my initial response to that is we already said that all of creation is groaning. All of creation suffers from the fall. So to say that Mars or some other distant moon of Jupiter or something that way isn't already tainted, kind of sounds like, I'm not sure that lines up really well. You could easily make an argument. It's already been tainted by sin. All of creation is groaning for the revealing of, God's children that way. So I would say that's not, from a theological perspective, a showstopper. This is, no, we don't want to spread our contagion around the world just by our very presence.
That's very interesting. Yeah, the all of creation, because of course the conceit of this book, which is a fictional book, is that Lewis is imagining a world that had not yet fallen.
Okay.
And so to your point, all of creation groans at this point. So
I
I
would
think
say
that's a good rebuttal.
Yeah, I would say I don't think there is a place that hasn't fallen yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, and that's why I'm pulling that quote out of a work of fiction. But there are also places in his letters that are like, kind of before we explore other places and at least take our version of sin other places, the human version of sin other places, we should probably try to make sure that we are, as best as we can be. We send our best and brightest, which so that I do like seeing Christian men like Captain Glover going up there.
Yeah, I've recently been going through some of the old Star Trek, the original series, and one of the things that keeps coming up is the non-interference clause. That you don't impact what's going on, and I think that's kind of related to that line of philosophical thinking of just observe and gather and do things, but not to interfere.
And I in the scriptures, if all authority is his, if we believe that, it extends far beyond here.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think part of the thing that Lewis is guarding against is kind of that you see it with certain billionaires. Let me freeze my head, and maybe upload my consciousness, or there's a sense in which they're trying to conquer death through scientific means rather than receiving the spiritual and physical conquering of death through the person and work of Christ. So I think that's another thing that's kind of underlying Lewis's theological and philosophical impulse here. It's that there is a conquering of death that we can have, but it's not a purely scientific conquering.
Eternity is better than the cosmos.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I think an important distinction there is a difference between someone preserving themselves and their own consciousness versus the survival of the species, needing to travel to another world. That's very altruistic and trying to see the species survive, as opposed to me and my glory, my, personality surviving. It's very different.
That's our friend David DeFelice on this edition of The Public Square. Thanks, David. Now, if you enjoyed this program, we have a longer conversation with David at thepublicsquare.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Look for the TPS 60 version with David DeFelice there. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time for more of The Public Square.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.